Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. In this podcast series, we will talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting Nepal. The theme for Nepal Conversations' first season is disasters. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of disasters and what it means for Nepali society. This series is supported by Levium Trust.
For this episode of Nepal Conversation, we are pleased to welcome Austin Lord, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University. Austin's dissertation research focuses on the afterlives of disaster in the Langtang Valley of Nepal, where a massive co-seismic avalanche occurred during the 2015 Gorkha earthquake, taking 300 lives and causing unthinkable destruction. Drawing from over 6 years of research and volunteer work, his work carefully examines the ways in which the people of Langtang conceptualize reorientation, revitalization, and uncertainty as they navigate the shifting timescapes after 2015 disaster, COVID-19, and climate change. In recent years, Austin has conducted a variety of research projects in Nepal focused on disaster management and disaster risk reduction, the political ecology of hydropower development, infrastructural politics, climate change adaptation, and the construction of environmental knowledge in the Himalayan region.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Austin, and thank you very much for joining us today. You are currently working on wrapping up your PhD research. Could you tell us a bit more about your PhD research?
Yeah, sure. And namaskar, Savelai. It's really great to be on the podcast. It's an exciting opportunity. Yeah, so my work, my PhD research focuses on the Langtang Valley. I'll say a bit more about exactly why, I think, as we move through with this with the interview. But at the simplest level, it focuses on questions of disaster, time, afterlives, and uncertainty. And it's about life within and beyond the unique disaster that occurred in Langtang in April 25th, 2015. As you may know, the earthquake triggered this massive avalanche in Langtang that was incredibly destructive. And so this was an event that is inherently multiple, both an earthquake and a massive co-seismic avalanche, in fact, multiple avalanches throughout the Langtang Valley. And this event has expanded and changed shape over time, creating multiple afterlives and aftermaths. And the PhD research is sort of about this. Currently, it's been a little over 6 years. This time span in which the timescapes of disaster have changed and altered people's lives and forced these different forms of reckoning, what I'm calling reckoning, reorientation, and revitalization. These three processes that are entangled as people try to navigate these timescapes and as people try to make sense of what's happening and where they are in their lives and to build meaningful afterlives. And it's there's a lot of different things going on. I think, like, it's been 6 years now. I was in Langtang during the 2015 earthquake. I certainly did not know that this was the direction of my PhD research. So it's changed a lot. It's incorporated some interests of mine that were sort of prior, and many new things have come up. But at the largest, I guess I say that just to point out that it's not just about the disaster, it's about the disaster as a diachronic unfolding event that becomes entangled with other events and disasters like climate change and COVID-19. But it's also very much about intergenerational change. And it's about other forms of patterns of pasts and futures that are unfolding and that are sort of being woven by Langtang Puz together with the timescapes of disaster. So there's questions about, for example, the Buddhist concept of the bardo, yak herding, and the futures of yak herding at a time when things are changing rapidly and many of the next generation are at school in Kathmandu and are not taking over roles in herding livelihoods. Memory work. There's a bit about anticipation and infrastructure in there because there are roads and dams planned in the Langtang Valley, which are significant. And that gets to these sort of bigger questions about what I'm calling futures imperfect and vital uncertainties about climate change, and these different epistemological questions and ontological questions about how we orient ourselves to the massive uncertainties of climate change. And at the simplest level, I think that the folks in Langtang, the Langtang Pas, can teach us a great deal about living with uncertainty, because they've gone through so much in the wake of the 2015 disaster, and they are still yet facing so much in the context of climate change. And we're all right now in the middle of COVID-19, a liminal temporality of COVID-19, which I would argue is its own type of bardo, the COVID bardo.
Yeah, thanks so much, Austin. That's really interesting because, much of your previous research has focused on hydropower development in Nepal and politics around that and in the Himalayas more generally. But could you talk a little bit about how did you become interested in disaster? Like what motivated you to work on your personal journey of becoming sort of like a disaster researcher?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I guess there is a simple answer, and it was very personal. As you said, I've been doing research on hydropower. I've been doing research on the sort of social and environmental risks related to that, the unique hazardscapes of hydropower, which, as you both know well, changing river courses, floods, landslides triggered by development, Bikas and Binas. Those are the sort of things I was looking at before, but I had never thought about disaster on the scale of the 2015 earthquake, and I had never thought about disaster on such a focused and intense scale, such as what I experienced in Langtang during the 2015 earthquake. So the short version, my parents had actually come to Nepal. I was at the end of a Fulbright research grant just prior to beginning my PhD. I was preparing to sort of come to Cornell, where I'm currently studying, and continue research on hydropower and risks, and in the way that I had been going before, sort of like a political ecology of infrastructure. And then my parents came to Nepal for what was our wedding. And my wife, Sneha, and I were eventually married, but in about a couple of weeks after the earthquake, in a smaller ceremony. But essentially this big moment of transition in life, and my parents too came to Nepal. I took them to Rasua to show them some of the places I had been doing research. And we went to Langtang, a place I had been a couple of times, mostly just to be tourists with my parents. And we went up into the valley, and we were on our way back down when the earthquake hit. We had slept in Langtang village the night before. We had attended a funerary ceremony in the Gompa in Langtang the night before. We woke up and we walked out of Langtang, the village, just 2 hours before the earthquake. And we changed our itinerary just the day before. Our previous itinerary would have had us in Langtang during the earthquake, and we would have lost our lives like so many. So I was in Gorkha, which is the lower part of the Langtang Valley, and there were landslides coming down all around me, and I was actually separated from my parents at the time. And interestingly enough, talking to a local friend, I won't name him right now, but about the prospects of a potential dam here in this valley. So that's a quick pivot just to say that that experience changed my whole life. And after that, I postponed my PhD. I didn't think about disaster research or methodology at all for the first year. I just thought about trying to help in whatever way I could and to sort of be useful. And I was learning by doing, and it was an imperfect process. But my interest in disasters began with the intensity of that experience and that disorientation and that confrontation with the intense loss that the Langtang Pas felt. I knew what I was going through was terrifying, horrifying, and scary. And having my parents there and being worried for them and not being able to find them. But all that was just a small fraction of what the Langtang Pas were dealing with. And I've spent the last 6 years trying to learn more about what it is that they have been dealing with, and that gap between my experience and my subjectivity and theirs. But that question, but the first question I had ever asked, that was a research question in Langtang, was about a dam. And I put that to the side and focused on disasters for a long time. And now again in Langtang, there are still plans. I thought it would be the one place in Nepal they would not build a dam after what happened. I've studied hydropower all over Nepal, but nonetheless, that dam is resurfaced and is moving forward even during COVID. So these different, that's how I became interested in disaster, and these different research questions remain in Langtang. Unfortunately, they were separate for a long time, but they're coming back together.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that research journey. Really fascinating. We were also looking at your website and all the beautiful pictures from your research fieldwork.
Well, thank
Uh,
you.
and as an anthropologist, you combine these kind of conventional ethnographic fieldwork with interesting forms of these visual ethnography. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a bit more about it? What are the advantages and challenges, especially in the context of doing research with communities affected by disasters?
Sure. Yeah, I guess the first thing I should say is thank you for looking at the website and the images. I haven't updated my personal website in about 3 years, and I think that actually speaks to my overall sort of changing orientation with visual ethnography. My visual work began prior to my anthropological work. I was trained as a photographer. I studied art history. I think I was always really interested in visual storytelling and like placing creative work in context. The first academic sort of thing that I published was a long form photo essay about hydropower development. And people really responded to it. And I think it was because of the images and because this was a lens into, literally a lens or an aperture into a strange world of construction sites and rapid transitions and changing rivers that at that point, when I published it in 2014, wasn't as widespread as it is now. So I was aware, even as I started to become something like a researcher and an academic, that visual storytelling was very useful for reaching different audiences. After the earthquake, I actually held back on my own sort of visual storytelling or my own voice through images after the earthquake, and specifically about Langtang for a while. I tried my best, like a lot of other people, to share images as appropriate on social media and to sort of help with the other types of relief work we were doing to sort of narrate what was happening, what the needs were. But I didn't feel like my images, it was my story to tell. So the point is, I've increasingly shifted to really collaborative visual ethnographic work. I'm really interested in this collaborative sort of creative process and collaborative authorship that comes through things like making a film together, like, for example, collecting images from around the world of Langtang that were taken in the decades before the disaster, and working with young people and people of the older generations to sort of recraft narratives and create new captions and incorporate them into a living archive that the Langtang community can use. So we started this thing called the Langtang Memory Project, which is essentially it's half archival project and half a collaborative storytelling project where memory in Langtang is not just about the disaster, obviously, and new memories are being created all the time, and patterns of past and future, as most researchers know, are extremely connected. When you create archives, you're not just talking about the past, you're talking about the future. So we've been trying to engage young people in these new storytelling sort of projects. So in some cases, the research methodology, it's not explicitly thought of as a research methodology, but the methodology of the Langtang Memory Project as a collaborative enterprise, which informs my research, can be something like working with a group of 10 young people from Langtang who want to create a photo exhibition of some of their work to talk about life in the aftermath of the earthquake. One of the most exciting projects was this collaborative filmmaking effort where we went back for the festival of Drukbotezu, which was the first major festival celebrated in Langtang, in a broad public forum, just a little over 3 years after the earthquake. So it was this pivotal and sort of indeterminate and really complex moment in the broader arc of afterlives and aftermaths. And we went back, myself and my colleague, Jennifer Bradley, who's also been working on the Langtang Memory Project for many years, and a group of folks from Langtang. We went back and we created, especially Gyalpo Lama and Tsering Lama. We went back and we had a couple of video cameras, and we just created this sort of multi-perspective document, sort of an observational, simple ethnographic style film of this moment of transition, of this disaster, not this disaster, of this festival occurring for the first time, hopefully in full form, imperfect as it is, as everyone is still struggling to figure out exactly where they are in time. And we called that A Time for Singing Again. And it's still being edited. We have different forms. This actually thing speaks to the process of visual ethnography. We created different versions of it. We created a 12-minute short version that went in an exhibition that we created for Photo Kathmandu, which was, I'd like to say more about it, I don't know if I have time, but which was the most meaningful project. And then we created a really long version, well, to my mind, really long, about a 2-hour-long version, which included a lot more just extended footage of the songs and the singing that we created more or less for the Langtang community, or community members who were interested in having this long form video on their phones. And the thing is that people in Langtang are constantly documenting, narrating, archiving in their own ways, using their phones and using other video cameras constantly. So I think the more that our collaborative work begins to resemble the work of the visual practices that the Langtang community are sort of, the community members are using in their own terms, the more I feel like we're on the right track, if that makes sense, with visual methods.
Yeah.
But that exhibition we did for Photo Kathmandu was really amazing. And to the questions of quickly the benefits and the challenges, it was just amazing to see how many people just walked into the show from different walks of life. We had this exhibition in Tamil at the Chaya Center in the courtyard as part of the formal, one of the a little more than a dozen major exhibitions for Photo Kathmandu in 2018. And we had 1,000, 1,500 visitors and people giving comments and coming in and telling their own stories and leading their own groups. And we had a formal opening ceremony with members of the Langtang community, where and it was collaboratively curated, importantly, with a few other of our friends from Langtang, and everyone gave opening speeches, and it was just this multivalent thing that was so exciting and so full and so thick with life and vitality, in a way that it's really hard to get a peer-reviewed journal article to do that. So as I continue to try to write and publish scholarly things and work within those discursive realms, visual methods, I think, obviously have the ability to transcend these discursive tiny rooms we create for ourselves in academia, and more people can engage with the work, and more people can relate and empathize. And that's important when you're doing work on something like disaster. There are a lot of ethical considerations with storytelling of after disaster, which, again, I think collaboration is key and community engagement is key. But I think it's worth it. It's slow work and it's really hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating, because very inspiring to hear the kind of collaborative work that you do, which draws on this different methods, but at the same time, putting the communities at the center and listening to their voices. But we were also reading one of your other articles with Galen Morton, entitled "Becoming Raswa Relief: Practices of Multiple Engagement in Post-Earthquake Nepal, the Himalayan," which came out in the Journal of the Association of Nepal and Himalayan Studies. And here it's like, it's much more, what we saw is much more sort of your personal sort of take on the disaster. It's not so much like the collaborative effort that you earlier mentioned. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about more of these, as an ethnographer, reflexive approach to disaster research, which draws on your personal experiences and your positionalities at the time, as you earlier mentioned, having encountered the disaster. And what is the role of this kind of more reflexive research in disaster field? I mean, what can you get by introducing this kind of methods in disaster research?
Well, I guess it's a great question. Very, very difficult to answer or to provide a definitive
Sure.
account. But I guess to pick up where you ended, I think this is a turn that, at least from my perspective, being new to the field of disaster studies and critical disaster studies, I think this is something that disaster studies is really focused on right now. Is how to take a reflexive approach, how to incorporate reflexivity into the work, whatever you might call the quote unquote work, over the entire course of engagement. Thinking about ethical questions before you go to the field, thinking about who has the power to go to the field, so to speak. What is the quote unquote the field, problematic as that term is in anthropology and other disciplines. And when you're defining your area of research within a disaster, immediately, you run into ethical questions, and you run into these things that can very easily also be labeled as doubts and as concerns, because it's a problematic enterprise overall. So but it's, again, I think it's worth it. In my case, I didn't, I don't mean to imply that there was a better way to do things, but in my case, I didn't have the choice. In a way, I did have a choice, and I chose eventually. It took me 1.5 years or 2 years to actually adjust my PhD project and change it and say, okay, I will be looking at Langtang. Initially, I didn't want to. Actually, I didn't think I would be comfortable doing that, and I didn't think I was prepared to, for a variety of personal and intellectual reasons. But my point is, I was in Nepal during the earthquake. The disaster occurred. I was very much swept up, personally caught up, and in a very embodied sense in that experience and in the immediate aftermath, as that paper you mentioned sort of tries to show. And it took me a while to make sense of what exactly I should do and what we should do, or who we should be. We formed this collaborative enterprise called Rasua Relief. We tried our best to help in different ways and to take a reflexive approach and sort of do things that were informed by our sort of general background and understanding as, at least Galen and I, as scholars. A lot of our collaborators, we're just the people who wrote the article. A lot of the people who founded Rasua Relief with us had very different positionalities. Nepali photographers, development workers, trekking guides, students. My wife Sneha was also one of the founding members. So everyone brought what they could. That paper was us trying to reflect on what we were able to sort of do and accomplish and who we were after 2 years. And it was preliminary. I think everything I wrote in that paper, let's just say I think it was a good first effort, but by Galen and I both. But from my side, I know that all the questions that I was asking myself in that paper, I'm still asking. I'm still thinking about one of the big points we made in that paper was that Rasua Relief, whatever it was, and whoever we were in the context of disaster, was inherently multiple and becoming and unfolding and emergent. And that remains true. There is no Rasua Relief anymore, but my own positionalities in Langtang and vis-a-vis other places in Rasua have continued to change and shift. And it still remains incredibly multiple. Sometimes I'm this person, sometimes I have this type of subjectivity or positionality. And it's rebalancing constantly over time between these different positions. And I think, and that's why I'm saying it's an ongoing question. The ethical aspects, which we were asking questions about reflexivity and ethics at that point, I continue to think about all the time. And I know more about the unique situation and context in Langtang than I did then. I also know a little bit more about disaster research ethics than I did then. And everyone in critical disaster studies is reflecting constantly on this. So I think reflexivity is becoming incredibly central in the field of disaster studies.
You mentioned earlier about your research on hydropower development and development more generally in the Himalayan region. And given the increasing burden of climate change, along with the push for infrastructural development in the Himalayan region, we're wondering what are your thoughts on how these developments might risk producing disasters or any other forms of social disruption in the Himalaya?
Yeah, I think that the hazardscape of hydropower is poorly understood. I think that because of climate change, as you mentioned, the nature and the scale of particular events is becoming increasingly uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainties in general in building dams across the Himalayan region, but the 2015 events like the 2015 earthquake should have created more, should have been more of a lasting call for caution than it has proved to be. I published a couple of papers on this. I mentioned them just to sort of prevent me from, as footnotes, to prevent me from going too long on this one, on this question. But there's a real there was in the immediate aftermath of 2015 earthquake, there was a mea culpa sort of moment. Thankfully, no large dams failed. No large dams really had been built yet in Nepal either, so it's not much of a fact pattern. Kulkarni cracked a bit. Other tunnels collapsed, but overall, the Nepal hydropower landscape fared a lot better than we would have imagined. So the memory of that disaster and sort of the interest in planning to account for large-scale seismic events didn't last very long. And then you have additional other kinds of events like GLOFs and glacier rock avalanches, like what just happened a couple, earlier this year in Uttarakhand, with the Chamoli disaster taking out a hydropower project. There are a lot of different hazards and disasters which hydropower infrastructure is exposed to, and then there's a lot of other risks and hazards that hydropower development and other large-scale infrastructure projects produce. Disasters overall are socially produced and socially contoured. So it's important that this actually gets taken into account during the planning process. And unfortunately, as to add those footnotes, I've published a couple of papers talking about infrastructural hubris versus humility, which would imply a sort of downsizing, downscaling, better site selection. There's also a great deal of strategic ignorance, which is not a concept that I came up with, but others like Lindsay Magui and others have written about. And there's other folks, colleagues of mine across the Himalayan region, who are making very similar arguments. There's a real strategic, well, I think strategic ignorance makes sense because it's pretending for very specific reasons of political economy that you don't know enough about these risks. And in fact, yes, there are a lot of uncertainties, but the spaces of uncertainties are growing in ways that we do know and we can reckon with. And irresponsible sort of give permits to every single project, everyone and their mother who wants to build a hydropower project, just because it's the national patrimony, it's imagined as a hydropower nation in some way, and because the investment, speculative patterns of investment say that we should, is not a sustainable strategy. I'm not opposed to hydropower development. I think that's very clear from the many papers I've written. I think intelligent, well-planned hydropower infrastructure development that follows some sort of cumulative impact assessment and strategic plan is what's needed. In the current moment, the urgency and the crisis of load shedding is no longer as intense as it was. a couple of years ago. So hopefully in the next couple of years, Nepal collectively will start to make more focused and strategic and selective decisions about hydropower. And I hope that there's a greater recognition of all the different risks of disaster that are tangled up with hydropower development and infrastructure development in mountain regions. But I'm not optimistic at the moment for a variety of reasons. I won't go into length about that. But just, I think in some ways we will see that the Uttarakhand disaster that happened recently will be forgotten and swept under the rug and written over by new forms of investment and development plans in the same way that the 2015 earthquake was.
Yeah, I was also closely following the Uttarakhand disaster and how kind of that triggered similar kind of controversies about what you mentioned, strategic ignorance, right? I mean, there was a lot of that thing, how it has been ignored for a long time, despite there were like a lot of warning and by civil society, but also local communities. But then bringing it back to your own research sort of site, Langtang, which is also very, as you said, it's close to your heart, basically, as a place. I wonder, like, what is what you mentioned as entanglement and the intersection of these different disasters. What's happening in Langtang, like, from your preliminary observation with this development intervention, but also with the COVID disaster, climate change. Could you talk a little bit about the how these overlapping disasters sort of are impacting or unfolding in Langtang?
Sure. I think I'll start with immediately, if we unpack the 2015 disaster in Langtang, April 25th, 2015, I intentionally refer to it not just as an earthquake, because as I said at the beginning, it's not just an earthquake. Most of the damage that occurred in Langtang was not due to an earthquake, and the majority of the aftermath that the Langtang people have experienced is not the aftermath of the earthquake. It's the aftermath of an avalanche or avalanches. The aftermath of the earthquake is relevant in major ways, insofar as, and other people have written about this, the community has to engage with the National Reconstruction Authority and the overall timelines of recovery and expertise structured around the particular aftermath of the earthquake, conceptualized as the Gorkha earthquake, conceptualized as a national disaster. But the disaster in 2015 in Langtang, the earthquake shook a glacier that was hanging, a hanging glacier from Langtang Lirung, which was weakened over time by climate change, which was loaded with a 150 to 200 year anomalous snow event, which is based upon other glacial geomorphologists' research in Langtang. And so from a geophysical perspective, that event itself is an entanglement of an earthquake affecting a region that had been affected by climate change. And the scale of the disaster, yes, it would not have happened at that same scale without the earthquake, but the scale of the disaster and the intensity of that major co-seismic glacier rock avalanche that buried Langtang village would not have been as such if climate change had not been slowly working on the glaciers above the village. So from a geophysical perspective, already that disaster is entangled with the timescapes of climate change and the slow violence of climate change and questions of climate justice, because it's certainly not the Langtangpas who are responsible for glacial retreat in the area above them or increased risk of cryospheric hazards. So from a geophysical perspective, they're already entangled. From a social perspective, if you go back 50 years, there was more frequent avalanches and rockfalls and rock slides in that area in lower Langtang village that was immediately buried by the avalanche. Once the national park was created in 1976 and tourism began coming and the glacier above started retreating back and the material that used to come over the edge no longer came over the edge, there wasn't as frequent reminders of the fact that this area was unsafe and the estimations of risk and hazard and uncertainty that the Langtang were making based upon their own experience changed as a result of climate change. So they were disoriented both by the changing patterns of avalanche hazards. I mean, there are more avalanches now because the snow comes later in the season, because the thermal gradients are changing. Avalanche hazards are changing across the Himalaya, and they will continue in the coming years to change. In addition to that, the social orientation changed. Langtang were disoriented not just by the physical manifestations of climate change, but also by tourism and ecotourism and the opportunity to, build guest houses in areas that were previously fields. And they were constrained also by the footprints of the national park. So that's a quick comment just to show how the disaster and climate change and other patterns of social and economic intergenerational change are tangled up in the 2015 event. A quick transition with two short points, I hope. In general, Langtang is one of the most important places in the Himalaya for climate change research. It is one of the long-term research sites, not just for organizations like ICIMOD, but for research teams from around the world. It's really one of the top 10 most important places in the Himalayan region for studying climate change. Some people even call it a research valley, which is obviously a point of interest for a researcher like me. So it is a place of quote unquote knowledge production about climate change. There is a lot of information about the ways in which climate change is affecting glaciers, permafrost. There's going to be more and more research in the coming years about cryospheric hazards. And there's some research, such as what I'm doing and a few others, I guess, from ICIMOD, also looking at the social aspects of adaptation to these things. So there's a lot of information. That sort of information can and should be accounted for in development decision-making. I published a short piece called Turbulence in 2019 for a collection on volumetric sovereignty, which sounds like a very complicated question, but just basically who is self-determination, who has the ability, what degree of self-determination do we have to speak about our volumes? And to what extent do we have control over our volumes, the volumes that resource our lives? Well, in Langtang, there are major questions about the glaciers as volumes. There are major questions about this hydropower project and this dam that's still being built, and who owns those volumes that are flowing through the Langtang Valley. Is it the Department of Electricity Development? Is it the hydropower developer and license holder? Is it the citizens of Kathmandu who need a high altitude storage dam for dry season electricity supply generation? So there's these really complicated questions about what exactly the risks are in Langtang, what's changing. For example, should we build a dam? And if we build a dam and it's exposed to these large scale hazards, which are entirely possible in a place like Langtang, then to what extent also, who is exposed to the risks? And there are several downstream communities as well below Langtang, not just the Langtang Valley, wherein life would be significantly disrupted by a dam, but below also that would be exposed to various hazards, cascading hazards related to infrastructural development and building a dam there. So when you think about who gets to control certain volumes and who gets to say, this is where we should build the dam, or who gets to say that the people who lived in Langtang for centuries prior to a national park can now only live in these very specific places, even though half of the village in Langtang is no longer usable as a landscape, because of the avalanche. They're really, really hard questions about volumetric sovereignty and who gets to decide what the future of the Langtang Valley will look like. And this is a place that I know well. It's a place that I care about deeply. I understand the arguments for building a dam in parts of the Langtang Valley that I think make some kind of sense. And I think there are arguments for other places that do not make any sense at all. But these are questions and tensions that are at play across the entire Himalayan region in many different places. Like in Uttarakhand, where the recent disaster occurred, is another example. So I think that what's happening in Langtang right now is it's really a crucible where you have the intensities of the 2015 disaster intersecting with the slow violence of climate change, intersecting with the slow violence of development, and all the questions of justice and access and sovereignty that come with both climate and development questions. And then right now you have COVID-19, I guess to try to wrap things up, where the Langtangpas are now, after the earthquake, even more dependent on tourism than they were before. And during this major pause, which is unprecedented in some ways, but not entirely, because there have been other dips in tourism due to pandemics and due to terrorist attacks and other things in the Maoist insurgency over the years, people are in this liminal space. The children, the younger generations are back home with their families for a longer period of time. And there's this moment of ambivalence that could go either way. And there's a hope that the young people being home for longer periods of time will help with things like retaining cultural heritage and language, mother tongue, language proficiency, and other things that a lot of people in Langtang have an anxiety and an anticipatory grief about, that in the future things will change so much that some of this will be unrecognizable. And there's a real parallel between that concern and the concern that accompanies questions like, if the road comes, if the dam is built, what will Langtang be like? What sort of lives will our children lead? And that intense space of ambivalence is itself a kind of bardo, where the level of disorientation in between different kinds of lives. The pandemic itself is this really unique kind of isolating, enforced collective experience of liminality as a bardo realm. But there's other kinds of transition that the Langtangpas are navigating at the same time. And one of them is still recovering in different ways in the aftermath of the 2015 disaster. So my research really focuses on how that long tangled aftermath of the aftermaths, plural, of the 2015 disaster intersects with climate change and with COVID, and how it shapes conversations within the community about things like, do we want a road? Do we want a dam? What do we hope for our children? And again, I think that those are all questions and that people around the world are concerned with. And then the really acute questions like, the really vague, uncertain questions like climate change that seem to be affecting the global population very unevenly are particularly acute in Langtang. So for that reason, I think we can learn a great deal from the way in which people in Langtang conceptualize and organize and navigate these multiple uncertainties that are all coming to bear on this place and this community right now.
We're now at the end of our conversation, and before we conclude, could we ask your thoughts on the ongoing COVID-19 crisis? How do you see this current COVID crisis comparing with previous crises such as 2015 earthquake, especially in terms of its political and social impact? And are there any lessons from previous disasters?
Well, at risk of avoiding the thick part of the question, I think it's too soon to tell. There are some parallels there, as I've sort of continued to say, in Langtang, yes, but also across Nepal. There are certainly legacies of the 2015 disaster that are still playing out, that are now entangled with social and political transitions ongoing within during COVID-19 pandemic. But they're just very, very different. Yes, they can be conceptualized under the category of disasters together, but they're just so incredibly different in the way that their effects are distributed, in the way that existing vulnerabilities intersect with the hazards produced by these disasters, by the earthquake or avalanche or pandemic. the temporality, as I've said, is the eventfulness is very, very different. And from my perspective, one of the things that's been hard, I guess, on a personal note, I had to leave Nepal in March of 2019. I was in Nepal again for my dissertation research. I was hoping to be there through the 5th anniversary of the earthquake, and I had to leave a little bit early, a month and a couple of days early, before the earthquake, the 5th anniversary of the earthquake. So I've always been aware of how these two timescapes of disasters are intersecting. But I've also, since that moment, been very aware that the capacity, at least my own capacity, to respond to this disaster and the ways in which response and aid and relief and help can be dealt with is really different. All of the things that, in so many ways after the 2015 earthquake, myself and others within the groups that I worked with, like Rasur Relief or just in general, so many of us just really tried to be present. We really tried to be there and to help and to be there in an embodied way and to provide aid in a very immediate way. And this, COVID-19, not just in Nepal, but across the world, is so wicked in the way that it isolates us, and then it really limits our ability to be present, and adds these layers of additional concern and fear and regulation about gathering. Whereas my research certainly indicates, and many others certainly indicates, in the wake of disaster, gathering is extremely important for restoring meaning and revitalizing place and community. So especially in Nepal right now, we're still so much in the middle of the hard part, this weird pulse wave, multiple waves that have come with COVID. Right now, I know my family in Nepal are just coming out of, some of them tested positive, and they've been self-isolating for a couple of weeks, and they're scared. And I've been trying to help within my own family. I've been trying to help folks in Langtang to the extent that I can. I've been trying to work with others from the COVID Alliance for Nepal and others to try to sort of lobby the United States and government and decision makers here to provide more vaccines for Nepal to help with the 1.3 million people who are between vaccines with Covishield, including some of my family members in Nepal. So I'm trying to help in ways, but I'm constantly reminded of how I'm constantly struggling with the challenge of being so distant and this enforced distance. I was hoping to be in Nepal next week. I was hoping to come in early June, and that's not, my wife and I both, to come and visit family, and that's clearly not going to happen. We don't know when. So there's different kinds of uncertainties. There's different kinds of vulnerabilities. There's different kinds of politics. So there are some familiar things. I mean, you can remember the Constitution being delivered very quickly in the wake of the disaster, and I'm sure there are going to be more parallels and more sort of patterns to comment on. There's obviously geopolitical narratives changing and shifting and unfolding as well right now, depending upon how vaccine diplomacy plays out and whether or not these vast inequalities in vaccine access change and when. That's the kind of thing I hope we all get to think and talk about a lot more, is comparative studies of disasters in the Nepal and Himalayan studies context, but also collaboration on specific disasters.